Hello and welcome to U.S. News and World Report. I'm Simon Owens, and here with me is Allen Guelzo, a professor of history at Gettysburg College and author of the new book, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, a Civil War battle that killed over 7,000 soldiers and wounded thousands of others. Welcome.
Thank you, Simon. It's good to be in touch with you and with all of your subscribers.
Now, one thing that struck me when reading your book was how politically savvy General Robert E. Lee was. Part of the motivation he had for having the Army of Northern Virginia cross over into the North was because he was trying to impact the Union's elections. What was he actually hoping to accomplish?
Well, at the very minimum, what he hoped was to depress Northern war morale, which was already pretty depressed in the spring of 1863. In 1862, the Union armies had had some successes, but also some really notable failures, most dramatically at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. And then politically, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in its preliminary form in September of 62, signs the final document on New Year's Day, 63. It's not a popular piece of political statecraft, and the responses to it today would flabbergast us, but the negative political fallout from that was really extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
In the fall elections in 1862 for Congress, Republicans lost something like 36 seats. So that's Lincoln's party taking a real political shot to the jaw in Congress as a result of emancipation. And then in the state elections, New York goes Democratic, elects a Democratic governor. New Jersey does likewise. So you've got two important states that move into the anti-Lincoln, anti-emancipation column. And then in 1863, there's going to be another round of state elections in Pennsylvania and Ohio. So Robert E. Lee knows that if he can get loose in Pennsylvania and look like he's having an easy time of it, that is going to have a political repercussion in Pennsylvania and Ohio, which could be really disastrous for the Lincoln administration. Because
so Lincoln's party was in real danger. This wasn't an imagined.
Yeah, I mean, if the elections in Pennsylvania and Ohio went Democratic, then you'd have the four core states of the North in Democratic hands, and it would not take very much for the governors of those states to come together in a meeting, as the governors did in 1862, and demand that Lincoln open negotiations with the Confederacy or else resign.
Mm-hmm. And how did, when he did cross over the Potomac, how did the North react when reports started to spread that Confederate forces were in Pennsylvania?
Oh, the first initial reaction was panic, and largely because nobody knew where Lee was going. So you have reactions as far apart as Pittsburgh. People are being impressed into doing labor building fortifications to protect Pittsburgh in case Lee is headed for Pittsburgh or for Wheeling, West Virginia. That was mentioned too. Or maybe Lee will turn in the other direction and he will head for Washington or Baltimore or Philadelphia. Even the mayor of New York City sends a telegram to the Secretary of War asking for gunboats to protect New York Harbor in case the Confederate Army shows up there.
What about the African-American citizens?
They had a different kind of terror because the Confederate armies, whenever they swept into Northern Territory, routinely rounded up free blacks and tied them up, sent them back south, and sold them in the slave markets of Richmond. That, in fact, is exactly what happened when Lee moved into central Pennsylvania in 1863. Groups of Confederate soldiers become the equivalent of slave hunters, and no matter whether someone might have been an escaped slave or whether they might have been a free person for generations in Pennsylvania, they're rounded up and then they're taken off to Richmond, they're sold, and in fact, we never really know what happens to any of them.
Well, one of the most fascinating parts of your book is when you describe how the armies obtained supplies in enemy territory. On the surface, it seemed like the soldiers weren't allowed to pillage any food they came across. That was an order that Robert Lee put out, but in reality, that isn't exactly what happened, right?
Oh, no, no. Officially, Lee wanted to restrain the army from wild pillaging and looting. And most of his concern about that was not so much respect of northern property. He really didn't want his soldiers indulging in behavior that was going to have them get out of hand, because that was going to have a negative effect on the discipline of the army. He was thinking about his army more than he was thinking about Pennsylvania farmers. But even with that General Order number 72 that he issues, nevertheless, Confederate soldiers, once they get into Pennsylvania, really behave like it's kind of a free-for-all. And anything that isn't nailed down is fair game, and probably a number of things that were nailed down, such as railroads and railroad lines, were regularly wrecked, pillaged, burnt, robbed, looted. The Confederates were not a bunch of Southern chivalrous gentlemen simping mint juleps and doffing their straw hats. They came up here as invaders, and they were determined to punish the North, because their feeling was, look, when the Yankees got loose on Southern territory, they did things like this. All right, well, it's payback time in Pennsylvania.
Well, even when they were trying to be diplomatic about it, they were still demanding way more supplies. I remember there's one part in your book where they hand over a list of supplies that they won, and someone in Gettysburg says, "We don't even have this stuff."
Well, and not only that, but when they offered to pay, well, what they were going to pay was in Confederate currency, which was tantamount to offering them pieces of paper. Mm-hmm. And Lee's order, in fact, provided that people who had goods confiscated should be paid in Confederate currency, but if they refused the Confederate currency, take the stuff anyway.
And it seemed like this might have been the perfect time to strike in many ways, because in a short period of time, Lincoln had juggled through several generals to lead the Army of the Potomac and was getting to the point where he was asking people to lead and they turned him down. Why was Lincoln having such a hard time controlling his army?
Well, because he was having political difficulty with the Union Army as much as he was having political difficulty with civilians at home. The general who really created the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan, great organizer, talented chief of staff, a marvelous military mind. But politically, he was 180 degrees opposite Lincoln. He regarded Lincoln as an incompetent bumbler. Worse than that, he regarded him as a radical, an abolitionist. And as far as McClellan was concerned, the abolitionists were as much responsible for the Civil War as the secessionists were, and a pox on both their houses. So McClellan tried to conduct the war when he was in command almost as though it was indifferent to him who exactly won. And there was talk towards the end of McClellan's tenure that McClellan would take some kind of political action with the army to intervene and force negotiations to be opened.
And he had a lot of loyalists too, right?
Oh, he did. The army, the men in the ranks adored him. And he was a charismatic, flashy character. He took good care of the men. The men felt confidence in McClellan. He looked like a general. He talked like one. And that kind of confidence is not easy to come by in what, after all, are amateur armies here in the middle of the 19th century in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And what was the significance of Gettysburg from a geographical perspective? Why was that the place where Robert E. Lee wanted to stake his claim?
Well, in some senses, Lee was not actually looking for a pitched battle coming into Pennsylvania. He would be content if he could just come into Pennsylvania, occupy central Pennsylvania or large stretches of it for several months, perhaps into the fall, and then maybe winter back in Virginia. In other words, come up and squat long enough to make it clear that the Union Army was powerless to evict him. That would make the political point. But he also nurses at the back of his mind the possibility that if he moves fast enough and far enough into Pennsylvania, that will induce the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, to come chasing after him, headlong, pell-mell, shedding stragglers and supplies and wagons and whatnot as it tries desperately to catch up. And by the time it gets strung out on the roads coming up into Pennsylvania, Lee can turn, concentrate on it, and bash in the head of one piece after another of that army as it moves right into his trap. And the place that he put his finger down on the map to indicate as the perfect place for that to happen was Gettysburg. So Lee had an idea that if it did come to a fight, The place to have that fight was going to be Gettysburg, because that was where the Union Army was, that was going to be the alleyway the Union Army used to chase him.
Yeah, and it was also a significant trade route, right?
Yes, because at Gettysburg, you get this marvelous connection of 10 different roads coming together, mostly because Gettysburg sits at the axis of north-south roads that link Harrisburg and points north across the Potomac. And then you also have a wonderful series of mountain gaps that allow an east-west axis to pass through Gettysburg. So if, as Lee invaded Pennsylvania and used the Cumberland Mountains as his shield, then the place for him to turn and pounce on the Union Army was going to be Gettysburg. It had the best access, it had the best location. That was the place that he could deliver the blow that might, in fact, knock the stuffings out of the Army of the Potomac once and for all.
Well, in addition to having the highest number of casualties, the Battle of Gettysburg was also considered by many to be the turning point in the war. And I guess my final question is why?
Well, for one thing, the Army of the Potomac, which, although it was only one of the Union armies in the war, nevertheless, that was the army in the East. That was the army that everybody noticed. It was the one most sensitive, the one responsible for defending the capital. When the Army of the Potomac reached Gettysburg in 1863, it had behind it this long, dreary string of defeats, semi-victories, confusion, bad generalship. And people really began to wonder if Robert E. Lee and the Confederates were simply invincible and were going to beat them every time. There were Union soldiers who were convinced of that. When instead, after 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg, it's Lee who withdraws with the tail between his legs, this is the biggest upper that the Army of the Potomac has ever had. And soldiers write home, quite literally, boasting about this. "What do you think of your old Army of the Potomac now?" wrote one soldier in the 11th Pennsylvania. They were proud to discover that they had won a victory, that they could beat the legendary Robert E. Lee, and from that point on, they felt they could go forward and keep on doing that. So that was a turning point for morale. It wasn't, though, the turning point of the war, or at least not as much of it as it could be. If George Gordon Meade, the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, had pressed his advantage, had pressed his victory, had chased down Lee, and forced him to a final confrontation, there's a fairly good chance that Meade might have beaten Lee completely, compelled the Confederates to surrender, and maybe brought the war to a close right there in the middle of 1863. But Meade doesn't, for a variety of reasons. And in fact, Lee is able to escape across the Potomac, back to Virginia, and the war drags on for another 21 months until Appomattox. But even though Gettysburg doesn't quite turn out to be the ultimate military decisive moment, it still marks the moment when the Confederates, when the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee really take the first step on the downhill spiral that does lead to Appomattox. Because never again after Gettysburg does Lee manage to take the military initiative again. He will fight a defensive war from that point on, and that was the kind of war that the South could least afford to wage.
Well, Alan, I really enjoyed your book. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.